The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 5, Second Revolution, Change in the Constitution of the Family. The right of primogeniture disappears. The gens is dismembered. The revolution which had overturned royalty had modified the exterior form of the government rather than changed the constitution of society. It had not been the work of the lower classes, who had an interest in destroying the old institutions, but of the aristocracy, who wished to maintain them. It had not been undertaken in order to overturn the ancient constitution of the family, but rather to preserve it. The kings had often been tempted to elevate the inferior classes and to weaken the gentes, and for this the kings themselves had been dethroned. The aristocracy had brought about a political revolution only to prevent a social one. They had taken the power in hand less from the pleasure of ruling than to protect their old institutions, their ancient principles, their domestic worship, their paternal authority, the regime of the gens, in fine, the private law which the primitive religion had established. This great and general effort of the aristocracy was to meet a danger. Now it appears that, in spite of these efforts and of the victory itself, the danger continued. The old institutions began to totter, and grave changes were about to be introduced into the inner constitution of the family. The old rule of the gens, founded by the domestic religion, had not been destroyed at the time when men passed to the government of the city. They had not wished, they had not been able, immediately to renounce it, as the chiefs clung to their authority, and the lower classes had not at first the desire to free themselves. The rule of the gens was therefore reconciled with that of the city. But these were in reality two antagonistic forms of government, which men could not hope to ally forever, and which must sooner or later be at war with each other. The family, indivisible and numerous, was too strong and too independent for the social power not to feel the temptation, and even the need, of weakening it. Either the city could not last, or it must, in the course of time, break up the family. The ancient gens, with its single hearth, its sovereign chief, and its indivisible domain, was a convenient arrangement so long as the state of isolation continued, and no other form of society than itself existed. But as soon as men were united in cities, the authority of the ancient chief was necessarily diminished. For though he was sovereign in his own gens, he was a member of a community. As such, the general interests obliged him to make sacrifices, and general laws commanded obedience. In his own eyes, and above all in the eyes of his inferiors, his dignity was impaired. Then, in this community, aristocratically as it was constituted, the lower classes counted for something, if only on account of their numbers. The family, which comprised several branches, and which attended the comitia, surrounded by a multitude of clients, naturally had greater authority in the general deliberations than a small family that counted few hands and few soldiers. Now these inferiors were not slow to see their importance and strength. A certain sentiment of pride, and the desire for a better fate, grew up among them. Added to this was the rivalry of the heads of families, striving for influence and seeking mutually to weaken each other. Then, too, they were ambitious of the magistracies of the city. To obtain these they sought popularity, and to hold them they neglected or forgot their little sovereignties. These causes produced, by degrees, a sort of relaxation in the constitution of the gens. Those for whose interest it was to maintain this constitution held to it less, while those who had an interest in modifying it became bolder and stronger. The force of individuality, at first strong in the family, insensibly became weaker. The right of primogeniture, which was the condition of its unity, disappeared. We ought not to expect that any writer of antiquity should furnish us the exact date of this great change. It is probable that there was no date, because the change did not take place in a year. It was effected by degrees, at first in one family, then in another, and little by little in all. It happened, so to speak, without anyone's perceiving it. We can easily perceive also that men did not pass at once from the indivisibility of the patrimony to the equal distribution among the brothers. There was apparently a transition period between these two conditions of property. Affairs probably took the same course in Greece and Italy as in the ancient Hindu society, where the religious law, after having prescribed the indivisibility of the patrimony, left the father free to give some portion of it to his younger sons. Then, after having required that the oldest should have at least a double portion, permitted the apportionment to be equal, and finished by recommending this arrangement. But we have no precise information upon these points. A single fact is certain, that the right of primogeniture existed at an ancient epoch, and that afterwards it disappeared. This change was not accomplished at the same time, nor in the same manner, in all the cities. In some, legislation maintained it for a long time. At Thebes and at Corinth, it was still in vigor in the 8th century. At Athens, legislation still showed some preference for the oldest. At Sparta, the right of primogeniture continued until the triumph of democracy. There were cities where it disappeared only after an insurrection. At Heraclea, Cnidus, Istros, and Marseille, the younger branches took up arms to destroy at the same time the right of primogeniture and the paternal authority. From that time, Greek cities that had not before counted more than 100 men enjoyed political rights, could count 500 or 600. All the members of aristocratic families were citizens, and magistracies and the Senate were open to them. It is impossible to tell at what time the privilege of birth disappeared at Rome. It is probable that the kings, in the midst of their struggle against the aristocracy, did all that lay in their power thus to suppress and disorganize the gentes. At the beginning of the Republic, we see 100 new members enter the Senate. Livy believed that they came from the plebs, but it is not possible that the hard rule of the patricians could have commenced with a concession of this nature. These new senators must have been taken from the patrician families. They had not the same title as the old members of the Senate. These latter were called patres, chiefs of families. The new ones were called conscripti, chosen. Does not this difference of name make it probable that the 100 new senators, who were not family chiefs, belonged to younger branches of patrician gentes? We may suppose that this class of the younger branches, being numerous and energetic, lent its support to the enterprise of Brutus and the Fathers, only on the condition of receiving civil and political rights. These branches thus acquired, through the need which the patres had of them, what the same class conquered by its arms at Heraclea, Cnidus, and Marseille. The right of primogeniture then disappeared everywhere, an important revolution which began to transform society. The Italian gens and the Hellenic genos lost their primitive unity. The different branches separated. Thenceforth each had its share of the property, its domicile, its own interests, and its independence. Singuli singulas familias incipiunt habere, says the jurisconsult. There is in the Latin language an old expression which appears to date from this epoch. Familiam ducere, they said of one who separated from the gens and established a new stock, just as they said ducere coloniam of one who quitted the metropolis and went to found a colony. The brother who thus separated from the oldest brother had thenceforth his own sacred fire, which doubtless he had lighted at the common fire of the gens, as the colony lighted its fire at the prytaneum of the metropolis. The gens no longer preserved anything more than a sort of religious authority over the different families that had left it. Its worship had the supremacy over theirs. They were not allowed to forget that they had sprung from this gens. They continued to bear its name. On fixed days they assembled around the common fire, to venerate the ancient ancestor or the protecting divinity. They continued even to have a religious chief, and it is probable that the oldest preserved his privilege of the priesthood, which long remained hereditary. With this exception, they were independent. This dismemberment of the gens led to important consequences. The antique priestly family, which had formed a group so firmly united, so strongly constituted, so powerful, was forever weakened. This revolution paved the way for other changes and rendered them easier.